Chapter 22. Sir Alfred. You came out here alone without supervision and built a fort? Alfred followed James across the open field toward the woods line. James wanted to show him the fort he had built. Alfred normally would not be as excited about something such as this, but being outside and with his son, who he needed to mend fences with, meant the world to him. Being out in this fresh evening air cleared his mind, too. Yes, I did, Father. It helped to clear my thoughts, and I was able to apply my anger in a way that made it profitable. Alfred nodded, smiling at him without him seeing it. James was every bit of 5 feet plus 5 inches tall to Alfred's 6 feet and 5. Alfred reached his arm out and pulled James to him. I'm proud of you, son. James felt a twinge of compassion and guilt, and then remembered the ruthless beatings. Thank you, sir. They walked, father and son, across the vast open field and stopped at the woods line. This is actually quite beautiful, don't you think, James? Alfred had his face raised to the heavens and his eyes closed, inhaling the air into his very being and filling himself up with it. His face took on a renewed color. James glanced up at him. Memories of when he and his brothers were small, and their mother would laugh at the smallest things they did, and in turn made their father laugh. James could almost hear his mother's gracious laughter. He shook his head to clear the memory. Yes, Father, it is. Alfred laid his hand on James' shoulder. Well, let's go see your fort, son. James nodded. Yes, sir. He walked forward and led his father into the woods. James could hear the whispers ever so softly in his head. They never stopped. David never stopped whispering to him. Alfred followed James deeper and deeper into the woods. It'll be dark soon, James. If you have never been in the woods at dark, it will frighten you. But rest assured, I will protect you. Alfred was never afraid of the dark. He spent his childhood running through the woods at night. This fort that James had built and was ready to show him reminded him of his own childhood. It made him smile. He couldn't remember the last time he smiled so much. Yes, he could. It was before Lilith died. How much further, James? Alfred was worried about them being able to find their way back out of the woods after dark. But he didn't want to let James know he also felt fear. It's not much further, Father, just a little way up there. He used his finger to motion up ahead as he said it. Alfred nodded. All right, then. He continued following James deeper and deeper into the dense woods. Can you see that, Father? James stopped and pointed up ahead a little way. Alfred looked but needed to squint his eyes because it was so dark. Up ahead in the short distance was what looked like a fort. It stood about 5 feet tall with an opening too dark to see in. Go closer to it, Father. You'll be able to see it better. James coaxed him. Alfred did step closer. He was still trying his best to focus and see through the opening, which was too black to see inside. How does the inside look, James? James raised an eyebrow that Alfred couldn't see. It's nice inside, Father. It is roomy, and we have stumps we use for seating, and one for a table. Alfred's eyebrows drew together. We? Who helped you, James? James smiled. William helped me. Alfred nodded. I see. So you and your brother would sneak out here to build this fort? James nodded. Yes, sir. Alfred stared at the clump of boards, sticks, and muddy leaves, piled high with a doorway he couldn't see in now. Father, you should go inside and look. James continued to coax his father inside. David hovered over James, whispering ever so softly. Kill him, James. He is the devil. Do not believe his lies of love. He hurt you. Kill him. Alfred hated the thought of coming all the way out here and not seeing the fort in its entirety. He could feel how proud James was of his creation, and he did not want to disappoint him by giving up now. Very well, son, I will, Alfred answered as he walked closer to the fort. James watched his father as he moved closer to his death. Memories of his father throwing him up in the air as an infant and then smiling at him as he came back down safely into his father's hands came flooding into his mind's eye. James shook his head. No. David's whispers picked up speed and urgency. Kill him, James. Alfred leaned down to walk through the opening without hitting his head. James almost yelled out for his father to stop, but he didn't. David was whispering and putting thoughts of beatings into his head. One loud thump and grossly loud crunching sounded after Alfred entered the fort. James, A low, painful request came from within the fort. James moved in closer, kneeling in front of the opening and looking down, though he couldn't see anything for the darkness. "Father?" "James, why?" Alfred had fallen 8 feet and landed on spikes that the boys had buried upright in the ground. No matter where their father fell, he would have been impaled by spikes. Alfred looked up and could see David grinning as he hovered over James. The moonlight shone down onto them both. "It's not your fault, James," Alfred whispered as he took his last breath. James watched him as he died. The guilt came flooding inside of him. "No, Father," James screamed. "Now look what you've done, you evil, evil boy. How could you do this? Your father loved you," David whispered with a smile.